Within the African continent, there are 54 countries that are recognized by the United Nations, and you might have heard a lot of these countries being referred to as third world, and it's because they're significantly less developed than places like North America, China, or Europe. That's just on the surface, though. The unpopular truth is that many of the raw materials and natural resources of the African soil are what power Western civilization today. And so let's take the mineral coltan, for instance. Without it, we wouldn't have laptops and cell phones. And this leads me to my very first tip, which would be to understand what it means to travel to a developing nation. Now, much of Africa has challenges like blackouts, a lack of clean running water, a lack of indoor plumbing, i.e., underdeveloped, right? And so, when traveling the African continent, you must remember that even though they have, don't get me wrong, there are modern cities within those 54 countries that are recognized by the United Nations. All of them have a capital city that is modernized and maybe somewhat what you're used to coming from America, Europe, or China, right? However, much of Africa, as you travel outside of those capital cities, are virgin land the way God created it. Okay? And so, what that means for you as a traveler is that blackouts would be a concern, for a traveler. The locals, they've been there, they live there, they know how to overcome these challenges. But you, as a traveler, it might be a little bit of a culture shock. To go hours without power. Now, in future videos, I will share my experiences and go over things like battery packs and ways to overcome these challenges. However, for right now, this video is strictly just to go over the 5 things that you need to be mindful of prior to planning your very first trip to Africa. I notice a lot of people have concerns about vaccinations, but not all African countries require vaccinations. Now, many of them will recommend, but like Malawi, for instance, they don't require any vaccinations to get into the country. Ghana is one that requires a yellow fever vaccination. And these vaccinations can be quite expensive. I think that yellow fever one is about $200 or $300 here in America. And, but a lot of these African countries are offering vaccinations on arrival. And it definitely would be much cheaper to get the vaccination once you arrive. Instead of getting it in your mother country. Now, if you don't have a doctor and you want to get the vaccination prior to going, you can always go to the health department. They have information about vaccinations and, malaria medication and things of that nature. As far as malaria goes, it's a big problem all across Africa. Malaria is another upper respiratory infectious virus that is transferred from mosquitoes and kind of feels like the flu. People do die from it. But all the times I've been in Africa, I've never had malaria, and I'd like to contribute that to taking the malaria medication that is sold over the counter within the African countries. Just as a preventative, like this last time I was in Ghana for about 5 months doing my expatriation research, and I didn't get malaria, and I'd like to contribute it to, like, every couple months I just took some of that medication that you take for malaria over the counter, just to prevent myself, and along with using my topical mosquito repellent, all natural stuff that I made. With those 2 things, I'd like to contribute that to why I've never had malaria in all the times I've been to Africa. And so, tip number 2 is just to check your health prior to traveling the African continent. All right, tip number 3 would be to do your research on the African country that you decide you're going to. Now, I know a lot of us may feel like, well, I don't know where I belong on the African continent. Don't overthink it. You don't have to know where you belong to take a visit to Africa. But if it means that much to you, there are companies like African Ancestry. They're a black-owned company that can actually tell you what tribe you come from from the African continent. And so don't use that as an excuse not to travel the African country. So if you're doing your research, there's 3 topics that I would suggest you do a Google search for. Would be GDP, currency exchange, and national language. And this will help you with travels for your very first time. If you're unfamiliar, GDP just means the gross domestic product, basically meaning the market value of goods and services that are produced within the country. That'll give you an idea of how developed the country is, right? Because definitely, you know yourself, if you bougie, you don't want to go to the poorest country in Africa, right? And then be all on YouTube talking about what I hate, like you didn't know where you was going. Currency exchange, there are websites that'll tell you the currency exchange of the money, like from your American dollars to whatever African country you're going to. And so depending on how developed those African countries are, your money may stretch a really long way. The only thing about your money stretching a really long way is that you can kind of take that as a marker of the more your money stretches, lets you know how underdeveloped that particular country is. And so in terms of things like relocating, you definitely want to keep that in mind, because the more underdeveloped the country is, you have to have more of a nation building mindset, because you will be starting from scratch the more underdeveloped the country is. National language is important because if you speak English, you don't want to go to a French speaking country. You might find it difficult just to even find a meal. All right, tip number 4 would be to figure out what documents you need to travel outside of your mother country and what documents you need to travel into the African country you're going to. You'll definitely need a passport, and passports here in America are maybe a little over $100. It's been so long since I've had mine. But you'll achieve your passport by going to UnitedStatesPostalService.com and printing out the application, filling it out. But you'll actually go to a local post office to start the process. And so they'll have you bring in documents like your birth certificate. You can't bring a copy. You have to have a certified copy from Vital Records, but the website will let you know where you need to go and what you need to bring. And that process takes maybe about 2 to 4 weeks. And so after you've done your passport, then you'll do your visa into whatever country you're going to. And so you'll need to go to the embassy of that particular country online and print out an application, fill it out. And I think the fee for that is maybe a little over $100. It's really inexpensive. And so you'll send in your passport, and they'll stamp the back of your passport with a visa to that particular country. And that process too is about 2 to 4 weeks. Now, a lot of these African countries are offering visas on arrival now, but for your very first time, I wouldn't recommend that, simply because after a 15-20 hour flight, the last thing you want to do is stand in line at the airport out the door trying to get a visa into the country. So also I'd like to add that with this whole Rona business, they're not even taking applications, from what I understand, at the United States Postal anymore right now. They're working a backlog of people who already had their applications in, and they were at a halt altogether. So it is some kind of process. Right now, again, with this whole Rona business, there are many African countries that are just now reopening. Many of them were closed, with travel bans for foreigners. So definitely keep checking back to see if the African country you want to go to is even open right now. And so, tip number 4 would be to find out what documents you need to travel outside of your mother country and what documents you need to travel into the country you're going to. All right, last but not least, tip number 5 would be to figure out how you plan to navigate this African country. Will you be a solo traveler? Will you take your family? Will you go on a group tour or a commercial tour? And what's the difference? A solo traveler, pretty much how it sounds, somebody who travels by themselves. Now, for your very first time in Africa, I just wouldn't suggest traveling by yourself. People do it all the time without a problem. I just wouldn't recommend it for your first time because you may, meet some challenges as far as the culture shocks and just adjusting to a whole different world. And the only thing I would mention to the solo traveler for your very first time to Africa would be to be very mindful of when you're booking your accommodations to really do your research, because I've heard stories about how people book Airbnbs and they just weren't what they expected when they finally got there. And so if you're going to use platforms like Airbnb, I definitely would do my research on the host. And, I wouldn't choose anything but a super host. And I definitely would go over all the reviews and making sure it's a good place to stay before actually booking. Because we're talking about developing nations, not a lot of the 4 or 5-star hotels, are there such thing as 5-star hotels? I don't know. I don't look for them. Anyway, a lot of the hotels in Africa don't have websites. And so, again, I've heard of people using booking.com, for certain countries in Africa and not getting what they paid for. So just be very mindful of that when you're doing, you're traveling by yourself. Now, bringing your family. Personally, I would not bring my children the first time. I would leave the children at home with a responsible adult, of course, but I would go ahead myself first, just so that I could get a feel of what it really means to travel an underdeveloped nation. And then that way you'd have a chance to plan ahead and accommodate your family as they come the second time with you. It's just something about rambunctious, impatient little children that could probably add some challenges to your trip. A travel group. Social media is a great way to find like-minded people to travel with. Facebook has a lot of travel groups. With travel groups, it tend to be like 10 or more people who share the same itinerary, traveling together. It's a great way to bond and build great relationships that last a long time, and you can find a lot of good discounts with travel groups and travel clubs. Commercial tours tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side, and they tend to cater to demographics that like safaris and big game hunting. However, my favorite way to travel the African country your first time would be with a friend that's been there before. Maybe you have an African friend that was born on the continent and they live here in the diaspora now, and they travel back and forth frequently. This would be a great way to get acclimated to the African continent. I myself did that very same thing my first time to Africa. Shout out to DJ Queen Agnes, one of my best friends, who took me to Malawi, Africa to meet her family. And a lot of times these people will help you be able to find cheap flights. A lot of times they will be more than happy to host you, which will lessen your accommodations, the expenses of your accommodations. And so you'll have much more of a meaningful trip when you go with someone that you know.